Hey everybody, thanks for joining us. Today we're going to be doing a Kickstarter preview for a game we've already reviewed. We're looking at Block by Block, the Insurrection Game, 2nd edition. We've already done a review of the 1st edition, which you can totally check out, but here we have a Kickstarter Prototype, so you know what's coming. Kickstarter Prototype alert.
Wii-oo, 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 Wii.
There it is. Now, for those of you who haven't watched our award-winning review of Block by Block, the Insurrection Game, we hand out awards to ourselves constantly. What we have here is a semi-cooperative game about a group of citizens rising up against a totalitarian police state. And that's kind of a really heavy subject matter, and it is. And that's kind of the point, I think. On the other hand, the art is kind of adorable, and either that goes together or it doesn't, depending on your perspective. But essentially, each player is going to be taking on the roles of one of the 4 factions. Either you're going to have the members of the community, you're going to have the academics, the students, you'll have workers, and you'll have prisoners, all of whom are working to take control of their city and push back the influence of the police and the police state. So just like in the 1st edition of the game, the basics are these. At the beginning of a player's turn, they're going to roll dice, a number of dice based on how many of their faction they've managed to get out onto the board, and then those dice will help them dictate what actions they can take during the course of their turn. Some actions require dice to be spent, some actions don't, and the difficulty, as in how big a die you need to have rolled, is generally determined by the part of the city that the action is taking place in, with things like state districts and high value targets like the international airport are going to be the hardest to influence, whereas more outlying areas that less people care about are easier for the insurrection to manage to take hold of. The insurrection is going to be doing things like looting to gather items, building establishments, these outposts that they'll use to either deploy new blocks or to gain supplies, and with the main goal being for the players to work towards a victory against the state. Now, important to note that Block by Block, the Insurrection Game, in either edition, is a semi-cooperative game. In the 1st edition of the game, I have to say we almost never played it as anything other than fully cooperative, and the designers clearly saw that that was the experience across the board, because they've drastically streamlined the agenda system, which is the hidden roles that everyone uses to determine whether they're working together or not. So there is actually a slight element of bluffing, which you can, and probably in this edition should, have spiced into the game. The socialist goals, where everybody wins together, the fully cooperative, are about factions controlling their own areas of the city, plus one additional district. And as soon as they can meet that goal, all of the social factions win together, whereas the vanguardist wins alone if they manage to occupy 2 of the state districts. That faction is just looking to become the power themselves. And finally, there's the nihilist faction, who aren't really interested in building much of anything. They win if at least 6 shopping centers are on fire, and they've managed to occupy at least 1 police district. Some people just want to see the world burn. Now, one of the consequences of having streamlined the agenda system and changed what a social victory looks like is that Block by Block 2nd Edition's 2-player experience is actually way better. It used to be that the game simply would not scale difficulty depending on the number of players, and so now, because each faction is working with a predefined set of its own priorities in a social goal, it means that the game is not harder, to win with 2 players than it is with 4. And so at the 2-player mark, the original game suffered a little bit, but 2nd edition actually shines very well. It's a solid 2-player co-op game. Another one of the differences in this edition is that the police ops deck has been streamlined a little bit, and it's easier to kind of move the riot police around the city. There's a little less in the way of interpretation of cards, and we found it extremely easy and straightforward and completely functional. I actually liked the art style in the original game a bit, quite a bit, but it seems like there's a little bit more art in this version, keeping in mind, of course, that there's a prototype. But as I said kind of at the beginning, there's a weird little mismatch between how happy all of the art is in many cases and how somber the subject matter is. So, I get it. Maybe you don't want to go for super gritty reality, but the prisoners have a puppy, and this guy is extremely smiley as his buddies throwing Molotov cocktails. And don't get me wrong, I'm completely on board with the idea that this uprising is in the right. Overthrowing this totalitarian government isn't a subject that I find in the slightest bit objectionable, but it is a little weird that everybody is extremely. I mean, this guy's practically grinning as he flips over a riot van. On the other hand, if I was strong enough to flip over a riot van, I might be smiling too. It means all that time at the gym was probably worth it. Speaking of the factions, actually, one of the other things that they've added that I really like is that each faction now has a unique ability, so that they're further differentiated from each other, so it's just enough of a little tweak that your faction has a thing that they're good at, and so playing one faction over another feels slightly different, and it adds a little bit of variety and a little bit of uniqueness that, especially in a co-op game, can help players to sort of work together by being good at different things, rather than everybody just being perfectly equal, and there's no reason why I can't do a thing if I decide I'm going to do it or whatever. I think that's a good change for the positive. Otherwise, lots of the core mechanisms are still intact. You're still building barricades to stop riot cop movement. You're still grabbing loot from the loot pile to aid you in your attempts to control districts or to bring the riot cops under control. You still have the dice rolling mechanic that drives everything. I like the dice mechanic. It's true that you can't really plan your turn ahead of when you roll your dice, but you wouldn't want to do that anyway, because the police ops deck gets flipped every time a player's turn ends, so you really don't know what the board's going to look like. And by rolling the dice, it can kind of feel lousy when you don't have good rolls, and so you can't grab that objective that you really wanted to. But by limiting your options a little bit with the dice, it lets you sort of have a direction during the course of your turn. That limitation can sometimes, I think, add a lot to the game instead of detract from it, which may be what sort of intuitively might happen. On the whole, we're really excited about this second edition of Block by Block. We liked the first one plenty, but there was a little room for improvement, and it's clear that the designers have seen it and have seized upon it, and we're really excited that this edition was at least popular enough to keep them working on it and have them move towards this second edition printing that we're really looking forward to seeing what the Kickstarter can do. In particular, I'm super hoping that the stretch goal for this fabric board underlay gets met, because I think it really adds a lot to have this just out on the table. It gives you a place for everything, makes lining up your grid very easy. It means the cards aren't sliding all over the place, the cards that are hidden under these block tiles, and it just adds a little bit of definition to the board, which I think is really cool. Otherwise, I think this is an excellent semi-cooperative game. I'm more excited to play it now in a non-fully cooperative mode than I was in the first edition printing. I'm definitely happier playing it at 2 players, and overall we cannot wait to see how far the Kickstarter for this can push what we think is an already excellent game. Thanks for checking out this Kickstarter preview of Block by Block 2nd Edition. If you want to check out the Kickstarter, we'll provide links as soon as we get them for the live Kickstarter page. If you want to see a few more of our full-length reviews, including our other Kickstarter previews, why don't you go ahead and click on that playlist right over there. If you want to see a few of our Game in a Minute videos where I do this except way, way, way faster, go ahead and click on that playlist over there. And if you'd like to subscribe to Gameosity and get caught up on all the awesomeness, you're going to have to engage the orb. Do it. Click, click. Join us.